Talking today about the Fellowship of the Ring from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which I have here in The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings box set. When I started off this box set, I made a started video, which I'll link to in the description down below, in which I talked about my history with this series. It was a long and rambling 30-minute video, so I'm going to try to avoid talking all about. I'm going to try and avoid repeating everything I said in that video here and just maybe give a concise version. The concise version is that I attempted to read The Lord of the Rings 20 years ago. This was right before the Peter Jackson movies came out. But it was before the Peter Jackson movies came out, and I had a feeling if I didn't read the books before I saw the movies that I would probably never read the books. I tried to do this as audiobooks. I got them, checked them out from the public library. They had cassette tape audiobooks, which I put in my car as I was driving along. And I didn't really enjoy The Fellowship of the Rings for a couple reasons. One reason is, when I looked at the length of this trilogy here, I was expecting, it's a lot of page counts. It's like 1,500 pages by the time you get to the end of book 3. Now, some of that's appendices, but still, it's like the length of War and Peace or something. I thought, okay, there's a lot of pages, but I'm sure I'm going to be rewarded by a really complex plot that I can sink my teeth into, in which there's going to be lots of stuff going on. It's going to be really fun to keep track of all these characters and subplots and arcs. I just assumed that the books were so long because the plot was so complex. And I think it does get more complex in the later books, but Fellowship of the Rings is really just a whole lot of walking around. Once I get to Rivendell and the Fellowship is formed, there's a little bit more characters going on, but then even after that, they're still just walking around. It's a long book, 531 pages. In which there's just a whole bunch of walking around and not much in the way of plot development. Certainly not a lot in the way of complex subplots or anything like that. The other thing I found frustrating back then is I was confused by stuff that I was not absorbing well on the audiobook. And, perhaps I'd be curious if anyone else has any experience doing these books as audiobooks. What is your experience? I don't know if maybe I just wasn't giving it my full attention. I probably wasn't giving it my full attention. I think partly I was listening to it while driving. I'm driving in the city, so, dealing with traffic. And also partly because maybe during those long descriptions of the walking around, my brain started to switch off a bit. I don't know. But there were characters who showed up where I wasn't entirely sure where they came from. Pippin and Merry at first, and then Strider, and then Gimli and Legolas eventually. I guess, most of these characters wasn't exactly sure who they were or how they got on this journey. The other part is when the action in the book finally did begin to happen in the Minds of Moria, I was confused about what was going on. I had a vague idea that there was some running around and fighting, but I could not visualize what was happening in my head. And in fact, it wasn't until a year later when I saw the Peter Jackson movie that I was like, okay, that's what was going on. I had some vague ideas from it from listening to the audiobook. I knew something had happened to Gandalf, stuff like that. And in fact, rereading this now, I can totally see where a lot of that would have happened. Pippin and Merry do not get big introductions. They're just mentioned as if they've always been Bilbo's friend. Strider gets a little bit of an introduction in the tavern where they meet him. But the fact that he is also known as Aragon is just kind of slipped in there very briefly. And then about halfway through the book, when they stop referring to him as Strider and then are referring to him as Aragon, that confused me when I was doing it as an audiobook. Gimli and Legolas are really given only the briefest of introductions at the Council of Elrond, especially Legolas. He's mentioned very offhandedly. And then when he's chosen to be part of the Fellowship of the Ring, it feels like he's just really thrown in there without any introduction. And then, the whole Minds of Moria scenes involve a lot of description, which even as I was reading this physically reading it, I had to read it carefully to try and visualize what exactly the geography of this underground mine was. It requires a lot of careful reading to get the picture of it. So, again, I'd be curious about other people's experiences, if anyone else has done this as audiobook. But I can totally see now how I missed so much stuff when I was doing it as an audiobook. But anyways, I've come back to it now. I'm going to assume that this being 2021, everybody knows the story. Everyone has seen the Peter Jackson movie, right? Is that a fair assumption? So I'm just going to talk about everything, and I'm going to spoil everything on the assumption that people are, if you haven't read the book, probably most people out there have read it, but if you haven't read it, you're at least familiar with the story. So this edition, which I have here, starts off with a note on the text, which talks about the various typographical problems that this text has had over the years. Then a note on the 50th anniversary edition. And then the foreword to the second edition. The foreword to the second edition is written by Tolkien himself. All that other stuff was written by the publishers. But foreword to the second edition. Now, apparently, there was a foreword to the first edition, which I would have been curious to read, just, to see what was in it. I'm sure it's online somewhere, isn't it? But the publishers didn't include it. The reason is apparently Tolkien didn't like his foreword to the first edition, apparently because something about how he was mixing up talking about his personal life with the story of the book. But even in the foreword to the second edition, and when was the second edition published? 1965 or something like that. Most of this is him making clear, no, this is not about World War II. Honestly, cross my heart, it's not about World War II. I'd already started writing it before World War II. I don't like allegories anyways. If it was an allegory about World War II, it would be totally different. It's basically 4 pages of him trying to make very clear that he's actually not intending this book as an allegory for World War II, which is interesting because even today you so often hear people say that it probably is an allegory for World War II, the idea of good versus evil in this big battle. And in fact, there is a lot of stuff in here which would seem to tempt that allegory. For example, Frodo saying something like, "Oh, wretched am I that I was born in these unhappy days. I wish that I hadn't been born during this time." And Gandalf says, well, that's what everybody thinks who was born during such trying times. But it's not up to us to decide when we were born. It's simply up to us to do the part that history has allotted to us. And you can't help but think, of the World War II generation. Although, as Tolkien, a point Tolkien makes actually in this forward here is he says, I was not the World War II generation. I was the World War I generation. In fact, here's the passage here. He says, one has indeed personally to come under the shadow of war to feel fully its oppression. But as the years go by, it seems now often forgotten that to be caught in youth by 1914 was no less hideous an experience than to be involved in 1939 and the following years. By 1918, all but one of my close friends were dead. Anyways, then after that we get to the prologue. So the prologue is written in a much different style than the rest of the book. The prologue is written almost like it's a scholarly style, like it's some historian examining the history of the hobbits and written in kind of that scholarly style. What's a good example here? There remained, of course, the ancient tradition concerning the High King at Fornost, or Norbury, as they called it, away north of the Shire. But there had been no king for nearly 1,000 years, and even the ruins of King's Norbury were covered with grass. Yet the hobbits still said of wild folk and wicked things, such as trolls, that they had not heard of the king. For they attributed to the king of old all their essential laws, and usually they kept the laws of free will because they were the rules, as they said, both ancient and just. It is true that the Took family had long been preeminent, for the office of Thane had passed to them from the old bucks some century before, etc. And I'm reading that and I thought, oh, geez, what have I gotten myself into here? Is it all going to be like this? But it's not all like that. You get past that and you get to book one, and then it starts to read much more like a modern day novel. Although, as I'm sure everybody knows by now, Tolkien was a scholar of ancient German Anglo-Saxon literature or something like that, and the style of this book is mixed with the style of the old sagas, the Anglo-Saxon and Icelandic sagas, which come through in a lot of the dialogue often. Let me see if I can find a good example of that. Yeah. Yonder is the Dimrill Stair, said Aragon, pointing to the falls. Down the deep cloven way that climbs beside the torrent we should have come, if fortune had been kinder. Or Cardras less cruel, said Gimli. There he stands smiling in the sun. Sorry, maybe that's not a good example. Here's something from the same page, a little bit up more the same page. Farewell, Gandalf, he cried. Did I not say to you, if you pass the doors of Moria, beware. Alas, that I spoke true. What hope have we without you? He turns to the company. We must do without hope, he said. At least we may yet be avenged. Let us gird ourselves and weep no more. Come, we have a long road and much to do. So that style, now that style, I believe, unless my memory is deceiving me, comes in more near the second half of the book. The beginning half of the book, at the Shire and stuff like that, is much more written in a normal prose style, but that kind of epic way of speaking starts to take over during the second half of the book. So it is this it is this mix of modern prose style with kind of an epic, legendary saga type style, which is a rather odd mix, but I believe it's done well for Tolkien. That this book has definitely found its fans over the years, to put it mildly. So people, I think, really like that mix of a modern narration style that's not alienating for new readers, for modern readers, but yet still evokes the mysticism of those ancient sagas, and that's what I think he's going for, and that's what he's succeeded at. Um, anyways, the book, especially the first part of the book, is very closely tied to the events of The Hobbit. In fact, it's always mystified me a little bit when The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy is sold separately, because these two books are so closely tied together. I mean, you couldn't pick this up without knowledge of The Hobbit. There's so many plot points and characters of The Hobbit that are linked all throughout the first part of this book, especially. Actually, while I'm on the subject, the reason that people call this the Lord of the Rings trilogy is because Tolkien apparently originally wrote this up as one story. So he didn't write this up as 3 books. He wrote it up as one story. And then he divided it into 6 different books, which were like sections of the story. And the publishers have divided those 6 books into these 3 volumes. So Fellowship of the Rings is the prologue plus book 1 plus book 2. And it ends at the end of book 2. And it ends, as you know, if you've seen the movies, it ends obviously with the story still yet to be completed. So The Hobbit, at least, is, even though these books are so closely connected, it's one narrative arc, whereas these 3 are another narrative arc. So I guess that's why they're regarded separately. But they're really, they should always be packaged together, in my opinion. Okay, I mentioned in The Hobbit, when I did my reread of this last month and was trying to talk about it, that now that I'm trying to give Tolkien another chance, I'm trying to come more to the realization that the landscapes and the topography and the atmosphere of of Middle Earth, is not a distraction. It's the whole point of these books. And I mentioned that in The Hobbit, which had a fair amount of description of the lands that they passed through. But boy, if I thought that was true of The Hobbit, that is so much more true of this book. I mean, the Hobbit, they start off and they leave the Shire, and that's that. In this book, it takes them like how many pages? It takes them like 150 pages just to get out of the Shire. So they're journeying all around the Shire during this part. They start their journey in the middle of the Shire, and they're walking, and it talks about the hills that they go up and the forests they go through, and all of that just still within the Shire. And then I don't know how many pages in when they get to the hill where Bilbo had met the trolls in the first book. And the original Hobbit, that happens when? At page like 50 or something like that. Here, by the time they get to the trolls, they're at like page 300. So it's just such a more detailed description of the journey and the landscape. And the adjustment I had to make as a reader was that this was not some boring distraction until I got to the real plot of the story. this was the real story. And I, as somebody who's not been a huge Tolkien fan, uh, I'm trying to parse out what the appeal of these books is to the real fans. And I think it's got to be just the opportunity to immerse yourself in this world in such detail, where you can visualize every hill and river and the trees and the mountain passes. And I think that's why, Lord of the Rings fandom or Tolkien fandom has been so associated with those drawings of fantastical landscapes, because it's just seeming to invite people to illustrate it or to try to visualize it in your mind. And I tried to visualize it in my mind as I read it. That being said, I struggled with a lot of the landscape vocabulary, like dell. What is a dell? I mean, I've heard it before. The farmer in the dell. Everybody's heard it, but what is it really? Because when he talks about all these dells, you're like, okay, what is a dell? And then Dale talks about dales, and I'm like, okay, I've heard this before. What is it? And Glen, and I'm sure I've heard of a forest glen before, but what is it? Or mere, or more, or I don't know. Maybe this vocabulary would be more common in the landscape of northern England, or I don't know. Maybe I just spend too much time inside, and I'm a bit of a city boy. I don't know, but I did my best, but some of the landscapes I found difficult to visualize, and some of the vocabulary I just didn't really know. What else was there? The Win and Heather. There's just all this description of the topography. Right. Okay. So, as you know, when Frodo and his friends set off, they are pursued by these black riders who, like everything in this book, go by multiple names. They're called the Ring Wraiths, or the Black Riders. And this is something I remember from the audiobook 20 years ago. I remember listening to this, and they're built up as like these really scary dudes. They're all in black, and they're on the horse, and you do not want to get caught by them. But then, after they're presented as being so scary, they just spend forever not doing anything. Like they're just always next to the hobbits or near the hobbits or right behind the hobbits, but never actually attack. And there are reasons given in the book. They don't want to attack in the daylight. They don't want to attack in the town. But I don't know. At a certain point, I thought, okay, this is just getting silly. It's like they're not even scary anymore. I know they're not going to do anything. If they had been maybe a little bit less built up, or if they had attacked a little bit quicker, maybe it would have worked better. I remember this because part of the reason I remember this is because when I got around to seeing the Peter Jackson movie, I thought, okay, maybe in the Peter Jackson movie it'll be visualized better. But in my opinion, it wasn't. I don't know. Take my opinion with a grain of salt, because my friends disagree with me. My friends used to talk about how scary those ring wraiths were. But in my opinion, the movie was almost even worse, where they were just moving so slowly and stretching out their hand to touch Frodo so slowly. I thought there was that disconnect between how scary we were supposed to believe the ring wraiths were and how little they actually did. And that's a big problem all throughout the beginning of the book, in my opinion. Also, while I'm complaining about stuff, another thing which is something I also believe I mentioned in my review of The Hobbit is Gandalf. What exactly are his powers? Like he's a wizard. He can obviously do some magic, and there are some times where you think, okay, well, why doesn't Gandalf just wizard his way out of this difficulty? Why doesn't he just use his magic to kill all the orcs or something like that? It's obvious. It's obvious that there's limitations on his magic. He can do some stuff, but apparently he can't do a lot. But what exactly those limitations on his magic are is not clear. At least not to me. And while I'm complaining about stuff, the whole plot about having to take this ring up to Mordor to destroy it has always sounded to me like a MacGuffin. Even before I knew what a MacGuffin was, I thought, okay, this is a bit contrived, isn't it? Why does this whole war depend on this one ring? Now, I was doing a little bit of internet research, and apparently Tolkien was very influenced by Wagner's Ring Cycle and the older Norse myths, which inspired Wagner's Ring Cycle. So maybe this, you have to give Tolkien some slack on this, because this is something that he's inherited from his source material or from his inspirations. But I just, and in the book, I mean, to be fair, they do go into the whole history of the ring, and they talk about why and how, where it came from and why it's so powerful. But excuse me, I still found it like a bit contrived. Okay, and another thing, while I'm getting all the negatives out of my system, I think characterization in Tolkien isn't great. And again, maybe this goes back to The Hobbit, where we've got 13 dwarfs on this journey, but very little to distinguish between most of the dwarfs. Keely and Feely are the younger ones and more energetic. Thorin is the leader. There was a fat one, right? But aside from that, even those ones get very little characterization, and most of them are just interchangeable. And it's an issue, I think, that continues on here. And I don't know. I haven't finished the trilogy yet. Maybe these characters will all get more fully fleshed out. But Pippin and Merry seem to have very little character to them, and seem to have very little that distinguishes them from each other, especially the further along in this book we go. At the beginning, there's, I guess, Merry is the more knowledgeable one about the forest and the boats, and the more adventurous one, where Pippin is a little bit closer to Frodo. Yeah, they don't get a lot of characterization. Legolas really doesn't get much characterization either. The elves are really built up to be these huge things in this book. There's so much elvish lore in this book, and so Legolas obviously ties into that, because he's the Tolkien elf on the journey. But aside from that, what is Legolas's personality? He's just the elf who's along with them. Gimli is a bit of a dwarf, I guess. Even Aragorn and Boromir, I don't think the characterization is great. And maybe this is on my mind a little bit, because I was rereading the Harry Potter books, or the first book. And I've been dabbling in some fiction writing myself. Uh, and I was rereading the first Harry Potter book, and I was struck by how vivid all those characters were. I mean, Hermione has a very distinct personality. Ron has a very distinct personality. Okay, they're a bit, what's the word? Maybe one note, maybe, I guess. But they've got such distinct personalities. And I was thinking, boy, I do not do this at all in my writing. My characters are so bland and interchangeable, and this is something I really need to work on. But then I read Tolkien, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, if Tolkien can get away with having bland characters that aren't really defined, uh, then maybe I can too, or maybe I don't need to feel so bad. Um, I mean, I remember when I first saw the movie. I'm like, okay. So those are the characters. I wonder why those characters didn't click with me more when I read the book, listened to the book, because I think on the movie they are given personalities. Maybe, I mean, Merry and Pippin are made into comic relief in the movies, which is not their role in the book. That appears to have been something invented for the movie. And again, I'm going to try to withhold judgment until I finish the whole trilogy. But these a lot of these characteristics you associate with these characters seem to be more Peter Jackson and less Tolkien. And yeah, in some cases seem to be going against Tolkien. Again, like Merry and Pippin are a lot more sensible in this book, and they're best friends of Frodo, and seem to be on the same level of intelligence as Frodo. Where again in the Peter Jackson movie, they're just the comic relief, aren't they? Well, not just, but they're a bit more clownish, aren't they? Um, okay, so all those negatives out of the way. Um, let me talk about some of the interesting stuff in here. They go into the Minds of Moria, and I was reading that, and of course I'd seen the movies, so I remembered those scenes in the movies, but I thought, Minds of Moria, that was in The Hobbit somewhere, wasn't it? I feel like I recently heard about that. And you go back to The Hobbit, and sure enough, it is mentioned in The Hobbit, where the dwarves were fighting these goblins in the Mines of Moria. Um, Here, the Mines of Moria is much more expanded to be this ancient, huge hall that the dwarves had dug deep into the mountains, where in the ancient times it was a huge, glorious hall where they had carved all these ornate pillars and decorations. But then the goblins had taken it over, or they had also dug too deep and released some sort of ancient evil, which I think is the Balrog, although it's not entirely clear that ancient evil was matching up with the Balrog, at least to me. But anyways, they go into the Mines of Moria, and they spend days wandering through it in the darkness, following these passages and trying to find their way from one way to the other, even though there's all these different passages leading in different ways, and then they go up these stairs, and there's this huge big hall. And I went over to Wikipedia to look up Mines of Moria, which I tried not to do. I tried not to resort to Wikipedia too much because I didn't want to pull myself out of the book. But Wikipedia said, that description of these underground caverns was so fascinating to Tolkien fans that there were all these board games and different mythologies, I guess, built up around the Mines of Moria. So I thought that was interesting. And then they get attacked by the orcs. Oh, right. I'm gonna mention something else here. Maybe this is a complaint. I don't know. So this is something that's confused me for ages, and I thought maybe if I actually read this book carefully, there would be an explanation for it, but I didn't see one. So in The Hobbit, they're not fighting the orcs; they're fighting the goblins. But in the Fellowship of the Rings, they're fighting the orcs. But it's evident that the orcs are the same things as the goblins, because the adventures in the Hobbit, the events in the Hobbit, are referred back to in the Fellowship of the Rings. But they're referring to those same events and calling them the orcs now. So the exact same events are being referenced in both books, but here it's the orcs. So the orcs are, I guess, are the same things as the goblins. But I definitely got the impression in The Hobbit that goblins were short little creatures, like the hobbits are short, the dwarves are short, and the goblins are short. I mean, besides which, that's just normally the way we think of goblins, right? They're not like the size of humans. Whereas when it comes to the orcs, I don't know, maybe I'm being influenced by the movie, but even from the book, I got the impression that the orcs were not goblin-sized creatures, that they were full-sized. And I've looked this up on Wikipedia, I've searched the internet for it, I can't seem to find... I mean, I'm sure it's out there somewhere on the internet, but I haven't run into it. An exact breakdown of what the difference between goblins and orcs are, and whether there's some change in stature between these two books. But anyways, they're in the Minds of Moria, and they get attacked. And then the pacing of the book seems to me to suddenly change. Up until then, it had been very slow paced, and they'd been wandering around for days, and had been describing every turn in the river, or every hillside they went up to, or every staircase they went through in the Mines of Moria. But then they're in this room, and they hear the drum beat, and the orcs are coming through the door, and then then the battle came, and it was very fast and furious. And it just seemed to go bum 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 with all this spears throwing and stabbing and the running down the stairs and trying to escape, which was good. I mean, it caught me off guard a bit because I was so used to the slow pace of the book, and I'm like, oh right, okay, this is what we're doing now. Okay, I'm on board for this. Let's do something exciting. And that was a really intense scene. Well, it lasted all the way till Gandalf's battle with the Balrog, which of course everybody knows from the movie. Although I was surprised when I read through this passage in the book that Gandalf didn't say, "You shall not pass." He says, "You cannot pass." And I'm like, oh, okay. Am I remembering it wrong from the movie? So I went back and watched that clip on YouTube. Gandalf fights the Balrog. For the most part, I've tried really hard not to watch clips of the movie on YouTube because I don't want to get pulled out of the book and be like in the movie mindset. I want to be in the book mindset. But for that passage, I did watch it again on YouTube. And yeah, in the movie, Gandalf starts off saying, "You cannot pass." But then that big dramatic moment is, "You shall not pass." But yeah, in the book, it's "You cannot pass," is what he says. So then they leave the Mines of Moria and they go to the forest of Lothlorien, where they meet more elves. Ah, yeah, the elves. The elves. Okay. The elves are such a big part of this book. So the elves, of course, played a big part in The Hobbit. They were in the forest of Mirkwood, and then they showed up at the Battle of the Five Armies and there was obviously some sort of alliance between the Elves of Mirkwood and the Men of Dale. But the Elves were just one of many races in The Hobbit. They did get somewhat of their own mythology, but so did the Dwarves, so did the Men of Dale. But by the time we get to this book, and this sequel is published many, many years later, Tolkien is just in love with these elves. They show up several times. They meet Bilbo and Sam meet a group of elves in the Shire, and it talks about how wonderful the elves are and how mystical their songs are. How mystical their songs are, and wouldn't you love to live with the elves all the time? And then, when they finally get to Rivendell, they spend a lot of time with the elves at Rivendell, which is talked about, again, how wonderful the elves are, and beautiful people, and great songs, and such... so mystical and wonderful. And then we leave Rivendell and we go through the Minds of Mordor, and then we get to the Forest of Lothlorien, where we meet more elves. So there's just so much mythology of the elves here. There's a story, you've probably heard this before. Tolkien was part of a literary group called the Inklings, where he and C.S. Lewis and a bunch of other literary English people would read their rough drafts to each other and comment on each other's work. And Tolkien was reading a rough draft of The Lord of the Rings, and there was one of the Inklings, Hugo Dyson, I think his name was, at one point just exclaimed, "Oh no, not another fucking elf." I mean, apparently he really did say fucking, even though this was like a Christian group, and this was, way back in the 1940s or whatever, before that word was really in prominence. But I think that quote is attested to by a couple different people. And according to Wikipedia, it said shortly after that, Tolkien stopped reading his drafts to the Inklings. Now, I'm not actually sure which point in the series that occurred, but I would not be surprised if that occurred here in the Fellowship of the Rings. Sorry, Fellowship of the Ring. I keep mispronouncing that because it's Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. So excuse me if I get those mixed up. Anyways, yeah, the elvish stuff is a bit much here. And I hesitate to criticize this because I know for fans of these books, that's part of the whole appeal, is the whole mysticism and the mythology of this mystical world of the elves. But when they popped up again in the Forest of Lothlorien, and we went to their mystical city, and it was like this land outside of time, and they were all so perfect. I don't know. Again, to try and see things from the perspective of fans of this book, there is... I think, again, there's a romanticization of this ancient forest-type world, which the elves are supposed to be personifications of, kind of like maybe in the way that the Greeks, nymphs or dryads or forest spirits, and so there's this in the Forest of Lothlorien and the other places, that there's this ancient forest world that's preserved in its ancientness, and I think that's the kind of mysticism that you're supposed to get immersed into. But I don't know. I thought when I got to that section, I'm like, but we did all this in Rivendell. We already talked about the perfect elf society in Rivendell. Why do we need to spend time here with the perfect elf society in Lothlorien. And it was a different society because it was, it was the forest elves here. But, yeah. And it's built up that there's this rivalry between the dwarves and the elves, and personified in the Fellowship by Gimli and Legolas, who, to the extent that they have any personality at all in these books, and like I said, Tolkien doesn't seem to be great at creating characters. Their personality is a rivalry with each other. But I thought to myself as I was reading these books, I thought, well, poor Gimli. I mean, how can the dwarves possibly compete? Tolkien has just stacked the deck so much in favor of the elves. The elves are perfect and they're semi-immortal, I guess. And they sing all these beautiful songs all the time, and they live in these wonderful societies, and they have all this great food with mystical powers. Why do the elves and the dwarves have a rivalry with each other? I mean, if the elves are like on this other plane of existence, what do they even care about what the dwarves are doing? I just felt like there was no way that Gimli could possibly win. By the way, I mean, to state, I guess, what everybody already knows, the elves in Tolkien are a lot different than the elves in the Brothers Grimm. You know, the elves in the Brothers Grimm are these small little creatures who, where's a picture? Yeah, well, you know what I'm talking about. Like the shoemaker and the elves, right? These little creatures who come out at night and are really small. In Tolkien's book, I'm relatively sure that they're as tall as men are. Again, that the impression seems to be a little bit different in The Hobbit, where in The Hobbit, when I was reading The Hobbit, I was imagining them as being a little bit smaller than men. Here I'm imagining them being as about the same size as men. But they are obviously not the elves of the Brothers Grimm. And I don't know, does anyone know, where did Tolkien get this from? Did he make this up himself, or was this from the Icelandic sagas or the Anglo-Saxon sagas that he studied? I don't know. Speaking of the elvish songs, there are so many songs and poems in this book. So you'd be reading along, and then, okay, one of the characters is singing now, and then we follow this for a couple pages of verse. And then we hardly get more than a few pages, and then there's another long thing of verse. This one goes on and on. There's so many passages here where characters are reciting poems or breaking into songs. You can see maybe that italicized font here is indicating songs and poems. It struck me as a little bit much. I mean, obviously Tolkien must have enjoyed writing it. And I mean, I know in the ancient world there was no TV, so people entertained each other by reciting epic poetry and singing songs and stuff like that. Even knowing that, the way characters were constantly breaking into these songs struck me as a little bit much here in this book. It's like, what is this, a musical? Is this like West Side Story where they just break into song every few pages? But I don't know, maybe that's how things were in the ancient world. Or maybe this is part of just the fantasy. So my brain has a bit of a tendency to shut off when we get to these long poems, especially if I get the impression that it has nothing to do with the main plot, which is true of a lot of them. Now, I tried my best to be disciplined about this. I tried to read them carefully and absorb them. But so often I had this thing where I got to the end of the poem and I'm like, oh boy, I did not absorb any of that. Okay, back to the beginning. Let's try this again. Yeah, so the all the poems and songs in here I thought were a bit much. Although, maybe that's just my weakness as somebody who can't appreciate poetry or struggles to focus on it. Again, I think for fans of this book, that is maybe part of the appeal, is that this world building, where this is an ancient world where people are entertaining each other with epic poetry from the times before, much as the way the ancient Greeks did with their epic songs and poetry and stuff like that. But I could have done with a bit less of it. It seemed a bit excessive here. Okay, I think I've probably rambled on more enough, huh? There's more to talk about, but 50 minutes, boy, that's enough. Okay, so I'm going to shut off the video here. Thanks for watching, and I'm going to continue on next with the Two Towers.